Sometimes games that try new things often don't hit the mark. There are an infinite number of variables out there, and even some of the most solid titles fail to find an audience to financially support them. When media tries new things, it opens itself up for glorious game-changing success or abject failure. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games the world wasn't ready for. Number 10. Resident Evil Outbreak. When you think of survival horror, most likely you think of isolation. You've only got yourself and far too little ammo to rely on. In the scramble of the clearly oncoming wave that was online gaming, Capcom decided to take Resident Evil in a surprising direction with the Outbreak duology. By making use of the PlayStation 2 network adapter, the theory was surviving a Resi-style puzzle box scenario online with other fans of the series. With a dozen characters to choose from, as well as lots of interesting locations, each with their own gimmicks and enemies, Outbreak wasn't just an interesting twist on the classic RE style, but it also built out the Raccoon City lore. Unfortunately, a lack of voice chat functionality made it pretty difficult to work with your team, and that's even if online was even available in your country. Hello from us long-suffering PAL players. It seems in retrospect that Outbreak had jumped the gun. Thankfully, dedicated fans have crafted PC servers that keep Outbreak's online experience a possibility, and thus we can all find out what exactly this would have felt like if it came at the right time. Number 9. Amplitude. When Harmonix's Guitar Hero was a huge success, the company probably breathed a huge sigh of relief. By their own admission, their previous output of Frequency and its sequel Amplitude had sold peanuts. It wasn't that the games weren't good, they just hadn't managed to connect on a major level with audiences. The rhythm game genre was still in a blossoming state, and the titles that had found success were those that were easy to understand. And even Samba de Amigos Maracas, as unexpected as the peripheral was something fun to watch and made you curious to try them out. Amplitude didn't have any fancy unique controllers, and its boombox spaceship concept was not something that connected at first glance. Without getting your hands on the game yourself, you couldn't understand what was fun about moving your cursor from lane to lane to match the rhythm and pitch of a song. The game developed a cult following and even got the Best Game Nobody Played trophy at the 2003 GameSpot Awards, which is the biggest backhanded compliment of all time. After Harmonix went through the dizzying heights of success with Guitar Hero and Rock Band, they paid homage to the die-hard fans of Amplitude that had stood by them the entire time by returning in 2016 with a remake. Number 8. Shenmue. These days, open world is essentially an expectation. It feels like about half of the AAA titles released in this era have large, sprawling locations to explore, with lots to do and plenty of distractions. Whilst Shenmue didn't invent such a concept, it was the game that really crafted the next level of what seemed to be a living, breathing video game world. Not only did Shenmue beat Grand Theft Auto 3 to the punch of an open world city, it did so much that simply became standard practice in gaming moving forward. Quick time events, NPCs that seem to have their own lives, and endless minigames and hobbies to partake in, just to name a few. The graphics as well were leaps and bounds ahead of anything else at the time. Trapped on the sinking ship that was the Dreamcast, many postulate that Shenmue's lack of sales dragged the console down with it. It was the most expensive video game production at the time, and it didn't stand a chance of making back that money with the console's low install base. Shenmue's impact is huge, and Sega themselves have not completely shied away from what it did right. The Yakuza series and the Persona series, both owned by the company, have a direct through line to Shenmue's cutting-edge open-world RPG style. Number 7. Eternal Darkness, SANITY'S Requiem. Eternal Darkness really uses its identity as a video game to scare. Sporadically throughout the experience, the title will trick and disturb the player by teleporting their character around the map, pretending that the TV has lost connection to the console, and most infamously appearing to delete the game's save data. What a clever and wicked way to mess with gamers who thought they had seen all that horror could do. You'd think that this giant sidestep in what the genre could do would inspire loads of copycats and experiments, but for whatever reason, the world praised Eternal Darkness and then moved on as if it hadn't just shaken absolutely everything up. It wasn't until the indie revolution of the last few years, with the likes of Doki Doki Literature Club and I'm Scared, that developers revisited the concept. Perhaps most horrifying of all is that this revolutionary classic remains to this day exclusively available on the GameCube, having never been ported forwards or made available on the Nintendo eShop. Number 6. Yaiba, Ninja Gaiden Z. After 3 high-fidelity and at least comparatively more serious entries, in 2014 Team Ninja wanted to do something different with the Ninja Gaiden franchise by giving it a well-deserved and high-energy spin-off. In terms of the gameplay, Yaiba Ninja Gaiden Z is just as good and as challenging as the core series, requiring focus and keen reaction time. Where it sings though is also where it lost a lot of love from the franchise's established audience. This time around your foes are largely zombies, and your adversary is mainstay protagonist Ryu Hayabusa. Completely shifting gears, Ninja Gaiden Z has a far more comedic tone than the main games, poking fun at tropes of the genre and the series itself, and generally being bombastic and ridiculous. In a post-Doom 2016 world, which celebrated the series by honouring it and playfully mocking it, you have to wonder if this cheeky side game would have landed better with Western audiences than it did in 2014. Detach yourself from expectation of canon and tone, which is a much more Japanese approach to gaming, and you'll find a beautifully cel-shaded arcadey hack-and-slash romp. Think of it as the Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon of the series. Number 5. Manhunt 2. The controversy surrounding Manhunt 2 is almost certainly more well known than the game itself. The 2007 sequel sold itself on outdoing the violence of the first, and thus was banned outright in many places around the world. Other countries had alternate cut versions of the title to get past their local censors. There was a lot of blurring in some versions of the finished product, and executions that were outright removed, with Rockstar quite understandably miffed whilst comparing the game to the growing popularity of films like Saw and Hostel. Those films were fine, why not Manhunt? As with many horror or gore fests, it's all about the context, and whilst Manhunt 2 wasn't pushing the graphical boundaries of the gaming industry in 2007, if anything it looked a little dated, it was as close to realism as we'd known. 15 years later, however, the game's violence isn't quite as visceral as you remember it. Still, underneath it all is a quality experience with an interesting story. The gameplay is stronger than the initial shock value of the original Manhunt, but the focus on the savagery of the game's executions overshadows an exciting thriller which adds some real darkness to the universe that people often forget it shares with GTA. Number 4. DMC Devil May Cry. The Devil May Cry series has had a tumultuous journey. Spinning off from Resident Evil into its own highly rated original IP, the sequel was derided and the prequel was celebrated. Poor sales of the fourth entry caused Capcom to take drastic action and order Ninja Theory to work on a total reboot. When it finally came, DMC Devil May Cry was critically acclaimed, but fans couldn't see past their own rage. It's a classic case of a game that probably needed a different title and set of character names. Most die-hard Devil May Cry fans were understandably turned off by the game not just doing away with a lot of what they liked about the franchise's irreverent tone, but actively making fun of it. Who can forget the silver wig scene? What Capcom thought was a clever wink and nod felt to many like a kick in the pants. If you ignore what they did to the character of Dante and just enjoy the title from a gameplay perspective, it's an interesting take on the franchise's style. At its core, it's clearly still a DMC game, but it has all new finishing moves as well as essentially an angel trigger to go with Dante's usual devil trigger. Whilst the story may feel like a massive misstep, DMC did its best to provide an addictive combat experience. Number 3. EARTHBOUND. In Japan, EARTHBOUND became one of the best-selling games of 1994. In North America, it made a fraction of those sales, and Nintendo deemed the experiment a failure. To be fair, American gamers were far more focused on the action of Super Metroid, Sonic and Knuckles, and the original Tekken. Most American and European gamers' first exposure to the character of Ness was most likely his appearance in Super Smash Bros., which made many curious to understand what made him so important to get this coveted position. Where most RPGs tended to be high fantasy, EARTHBOUND and its series broke the trend by setting its turn-based battle system in the real world. Making the mundane fantastical and interesting is at the game's core, and it enraptured many imaginations across the world. It influenced the likes of Yakuza as well as South Park: The Stick of Truth. Toby Fox has made no qualms about the effect EARTHBOUND had on him as a gamer and developer, and this is reflected across his own modern cult hit Undertale. EARTHBOUND's influence is felt today through indie RPGs like Undertale and the games that it, in turn, inspires. Number 2. System Shock. If you were to picture the FPS genre as a ladder, it's pretty obvious that the first rung of that ladder is the original Doom. The game absolutely changed everything, and audiences were keen for more. Whilst many games were doing their best to emulate the style, when Doom 2 arrived, it overshadowed something that was already turning the genre on its head. In 1994, Looking Glass released System Shock, a game that did away with Doom's frenetic nature and instead crafted a slower, more deliberate pace and world. Exploring a derelict space station, the player pieces together what's happened through environmental storytelling and recorded logs. Combat is far less instantly gratifying, demanding more tactical consideration with its limited inventory and imperfect weapons. Whilst the game reviewed well, it's generally understood that its cost to make far exceeded the sales numbers. System Shock did manage to garner a sequel, and most importantly, some of its greatest strengths went on to live again in BioShock when its creators worked under 2K Games. It was the success of this game that made many aware of its spiritual predecessor and began a new cult status. Without System Shock weaving narrative storytelling into its gameplay, then we wouldn't have titles like Metroid Prime, Prey, or even possibly the likes of Deus Ex and Resident Evil. Number 1. Star Wars Galaxies. What upset many about 2006 MMORPG Star Wars Galaxies at the time was that out of the dozens of possible jobs and roles that players could assign to their characters, Jedi wasn't among them. This was deliberate for a few reasons, but chiefly among them the developers were trying to steer away from combat-focused classes. Star Wars Galaxies was more about roleplay than the standard MMO loop of hitting things and watching the numbers go up. Playing as merchants, chefs, doctors, etc. meant actually fulfilling your role and becoming part of an actual fictional community. A few years after Star Wars Galaxy servers closed, life sim games were all the rage. Animal Crossing, Harvest Moon and Stardew Valley, just to name a few, are the kind of chill titles that are all about social simulation. Animal Crossing in particular thrives on growing and interacting with a community, and New Horizons on Nintendo Switch has sold nearly 40 million copies alone. More than that, the space for role-playing in general has never been bigger. People watch Dungeons & Dragons groups online not to see who gets the highest damage rolls, but for the stories, the characters and the role-playing. This is something that gaming could do more to cater to, in the way that Star Wars Galaxies did years ago. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video in the comments below, and any other video games you can think of that the world wasn't ready for yet. Maybe it's something that was ahead of its time, or something that was derided upon release like a DMC or a Yaiba Ninja Gaiden Z that's actually got some nuggets of goodness in it. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.